Hi, I'm Victor, the main organizer of the Full Stack Flutter conference. On this channel we publish the best talks from the conference every week throughout the year, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. I'm also the founder of ServerPod, so if you want to build your backend in Dart, make sure to check that out too. Wyma hosts the Flying High with Flutter podcast. He is also a tech company founder and consultant who has worked with robotics, AI, fintech, crypto, and of course, mobile app development. He will talk about how he stays in touch with the Flutter ecosystem. Let's go!
Hi, some of you may already know who I am. I'm Wyma, the host of Flying High with Flutter podcast. What you may not know is that I'm also doing many other things. I want to give this presentation to inspire others who may share a similar interest in Flutter as I do, but are not actively working with Flutter. I've been creating software for well over a decade. With this, I've had the opportunity to create mobile apps. I was lucky enough to have experience working on both native and hybrid apps in my career. Experiences like this have led me to where I am today. For now, I'm going to talk about my time as the owner of Angora. We are a software consultant company that specializes in Elixir, Flutter, and Rust. We find that these three technologies allow us to tackle all the problems that we've run into so far. We initially weren't even going to look at Flutter, let alone even knew about Flutter. Most of us have tried the different types of hybrid solutions in the past, so you can understand why I did my best to stay far away from them. In fact, I was more inclined to write native apps until I gave Flutter a try. Our first use of Flutter came as a result of a client. He was using an outside service to collect data about fitness activity of his users. It required users to create two accounts, one for his platform and another to different platform just to collect the fitness data from his users. He found this severely hurt his ability to grow as this was more work for the user to do. Also, his users would need to actually have to manually turn on and off the activity tracking when they wanted their fitness activities to be counted. He came to the conclusion that in order to grow his platform, he needed to use his users' passive step data instead of requiring users to manually trigger the tracking of their movement. This idea worked perfectly as his user base grew due to having a single app for users to sign up, log in, and collect their step data in order to redeem rewards without any manual work required. While this greatly helped his business, we did run into quite a few issues because we were brand new to Flutter. We made several initial mistakes, such as using a lot of stateful widgets without any use of software patterns, which can be really a nightmare to debug. We basically learned how to do Flutter like most people learn how to bowl. We just kept throwing gutter balls until we finally found some small techniques that made managing the application easier, but over time. Our first desktop application was also an amazing experience. At this time, we were very familiar with Flutter, using Flutter as a tool to create amazing mobile applications, but we didn't yet try to create an app for desktop just yet. Upon visiting our client, seeing how they work, we realized that they're very used to working with a responsive desktop application. Their existing app that they were working with was always showing stale data, slow to update to the latest information, and required the web browser to be open, which could easily be lost due to the many web browsers they tend to keep open while they were working. What was so amazing is that we managed to develop the entire app on a Mac with just minor compatibility issues that were solved once we compiled on Windows and performed some initial testing. This app is still being used today, which has allowed them to replace their existing Bloomberg solution with greatly reduced cost and increased profits. Our first Flutter web application was for a company that provides a solution for medical companies to conduct their test trials. Most of the medical trials are being conducted in countries where English may not be their first language, so we need to support multiple languages, which Flutter can easily do. The most important part about Flutter is that it's multi-platform. The initial plan is that their first version is on the web, and another version will be run on an iPad, as most of the participants in the trials are in areas with low internet coverage. The idea is that they'd like to use an iPad to collect the results and sync that data back into the cloud once they have data. Having a system that's built with multi-platform support in mind helps businesses to keep costs low, as most of the work can be reused across the multiple platforms with just some minor changes. This helps to make Flutter a cost-effective solution. Now, this brings us to the podcast. As I stated before, Flutter really changed my mindset about going non-native. I felt Flutter really made it possible for me to create any kind of UI. It contained the basic building blocks that can be assembled into whatever I needed. This made me want to help promote Flutter. In Hong Kong, Flutter isn't as popular as React Native or even Going Native. Hong Kong is also a pretty small market overall. Also, at the time, someone introduced me to the idea of creating a podcast, and I noticed that there weren't any consistent Flutter podcasts. So I thought maybe I can help promote Flutter and raise awareness about the work we are doing with Flutter. Another amazing benefit I've received from doing the podcast is that I can get intimate time with the guests I invite on the show. I've managed to build some great relationships with some of the guests that have come onto the show, which has helped me when I've run into issues. Casper Lund is one of the creators of Dart programming language. It was great to get him to come onto the show as I got to learn a lot about the origins of Dart. I'm very fascinated by history, and learning about Dart's history helped me to understand more about why things are the way they are. Now, Lucas was a super interesting guest from my own personal interests because I've always had an interest in how video games are created, and thanks to his effort, the community has a library called Flame, which allows us to use Flutter to create games. And finally, Victor, whom everyone here should know. He's one of my few returning guests on the show, and the work he's put in ServerPod is invaluable to the Flutter community. I'm hoping that ServerPod will stay around as long as Flutter is around. Having the same programming language for your client app as your server app is great for teams to be cross-domain, so anyone can work on either side. Now, as an update to my work with Flutter, sadly, I haven't been doing as much Flutter as I'd like to. I've personally found that mobile apps come and go. Sometimes they're very hot, and we're doing a lot of Flutter, and sometimes they're not as hot, and we don't have any work that can be done in Flutter. As of now, we are providing support for the Flutter desktop, which is actually very stable and works well since the day we created it. We're also finally working again on the Flutter web project that we mentioned earlier. And as I've said, we aren't doing as much Flutter as we were doing before, but that doesn't mean we are any less passionate about Flutter. We are still producing podcast episodes, we are still following the Flutter updates, and we also still follow other Flutter users on X. What I wanted to talk about in this talk was let users know that it's okay to not be doing any Flutter in your daily work. That doesn't make you any less passionate about Flutter. Some of us will have career changes, project changes, or any other number of reasons that we may not be using Flutter anymore. Now, even though you're not using Flutter in your daily work, it doesn't mean you need to stop being involved with Flutter. There's so many other things you can do besides doing Flutter in your daily work. There's more than one way to stay engaged in Flutter, even though you're not actively using Flutter for your work. One important way to stay engaged with the Flutter community is to help nurture other Flutter developers. Don't forget that we're all beginners at one point. The reason I struggled to build my first app is that I didn't have someone whom I could ask questions or sample projects where I could learn from. At that time, I wasn't aware of any Flutter communities, so I learned from a few books and some online YouTube tutorials. If I had someone whom I could learn from, I'm sure I would have learned much faster and better than how I learned before. You don't need to give one-to-one help. As I've said before, I've learned from books and videos. Producing tutorial content for the masses can be a great help to those who are new to Flutter. Another way you can stay connected with Flutter is that you can still use Flutter for your own personal projects. Most of us developers have an itch to create new projects or experiment with ideas. Using Flutter to prototype the idea is a way to ensure that you don't lose your skills, so if you ever go back to creating Flutter apps, it'll still be fresh in your mind. Something that I tend to do so I can still stay up to date with other technologies is I can listen to podcasts. All of us have a lot of things we need to do, and most of it we can do basically on autopilot, like going shopping, working out, walking, etc. Instead of turning on our favorite song, we can do ourselves a favor and turn on a podcast and listen to just the latest news about any particular topic that interests us, such as Flutter. Just remember that no matter what you do in your career, you never need to stop being involved with Flutter, even when you're not doing Flutter. Thank you.